Let's get there. All right. We got a screen. We got a screen. Cool. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a good weekend. We're back at it Monday, last week before spring break. It's kind of hard to believe, right? Like, it feels like we just started the semester and all of a sudden it's spring break. I don't know about you guys, but I am super needing a spring break right now. So if that's a universal feeling, then we'll make it through this week. And we'll have a little bit of a break and then get back for the second half of the semester. In advance of today's class, I asked you to fill out a survey to just kind of reflect on your standing in your course at this point. Your midterm grades are in what you see in Blackboard. They're due for me by the end of the week. I probably won't get your lab practicals graded and added to the midterms by that time. I might try to. We'll see how it goes. But you can see where you stand right now in the class anyway. And I asked you to just kind of check that out, think about what you've been doing and where you're going from here. And you had a little bit of reading over the weekend as well, just make sure you're finishing up all your reading on muscles. Today we start a new section talking about the skull. We're going to work through this today and Wednesday. Just as a note, this material will not be on the quiz on Friday. I had said originally that the quiz would cover material through what we do today. But since we're starting something new today, it doesn't really make sense. So just to clarify, the quiz will cover everything we did on muscles. And there was one lecture on joints, that very last lecture on joints that we didn't cover with the exam. That will be covered on the quiz as well. And that information is all in your class program for Wednesday. Your class program for Wednesday is pretty short. I just have a 4-minute video for you to watch and like 2 pages of reading in the textbook about the skull. I wanted to keep it short because tomorrow you've got your lab practical. I hope that you're able to brush up on that. I hope the review session went well yesterday with Chase. I'll give some reminders at the end of class, but I do have open hours today if you want to come in and brush up on anything. I've got some reminders about that. So before we start in on the skull and our agenda for today, questions for me or just for anybody. I mean, you could ask anybody in the room a question, really. All right, so today's agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to start off. I actually do have an interesting human anatomy in the news section for you today, and then we're going to talk about the skull. And then I've just got some reminders and a ticket out for you. So let's, I want to start off with this story. So this is a great example of how sometimes a science story gets overblown by the media and why it's important to kind of make sure you, or at least somebody, is going back and reading the original study and thinking about it. So this came out last year or the year before. We saw headlines from some pretty reputable news sources that looked like this. Horns are growing on young people's skulls. Phone uses to blame, research suggests. We see another one. And there's similar headlines like that all around. But if you look at it a little more closely, here's a headline from Business Insider, which actually went back and looked at the original study and was like, wait a second. And their headline is, no, we're probably not growing horns because of our cell phone use. And one of the authors of the study actually sells posture pillows. So what is this all about? A study came out in 2019. In the journal Scientific Reports, which is it's a reputable journal. And the study has the really oblique headline, prominent exostosis projecting from the occipital squama, more substantial and prevalent in young adult than older age groups. And what they found is there is something called the occipital protuberance here. So this is an X-ray image of a skull. That's not the best. Well, you can see it pretty well. A lateral view, so someone facing this way. And on the back of your occipital bone right here, you've got a little protuberance. And you can see it blown up in this image right here. It's this guy here. And they found in this study that there was this feature, which technically is called an enthesophyte, which is a word that refers to where bone, you have an outgrowth of bone where a ligament attaches. So that's an important vocabulary word to know. So a bony spur forming at a ligament or tendon insertion into bone, and it grows in that direction. So remember, again and again, I've said the bone is a living, dynamic organ. It constantly adapts to the stresses that are put on it. So an enthesophyte is essentially the bone growing out where there's a ligament attaching. And they found that essentially the results were that they found that this feature was more prominent in younger folks age 18 to 30. And so they speculated without any evidence that, hey, maybe this is related to people using phones and like bending down their necks like this all the time. And then news headlines picked it up and were like, we're growing horns because of our cell phones. But it's really not the case. And actually, if you look at this study in more detail, you find a lot of problems with it. First of all, the people that were in the study were not like a randomly selected group from the population. They're in fact all patients at a chiropractic office. What's the word I'm looking for? Clinic. Clinic, that's the word. And so it wasn't a random group of people. Secondly, this feature is actually pretty common in the population historically, and they did happen to find more in a younger age group, but it's not like it doesn't happen in older folks as well. One of the authors of the paper actually runs the chiropractic clinic or had some association with it, and also sells posture correcting pillows. So there's some confounding things there. That doesn't mean that someone who sells posture correcting pillows can't produce a study like this. But they never disclose that information, which is a potential conflict of interest, which you want to tell people about. And also, and this isn't the author's fault, but the news that picked it up referred to this as a horn. Is far from a horn. It's a bony spur. Horns technically consist of keratin, which is the same substance in your fingernails and your hair. So a horn on let's say a rhinoceros or a cow or something like that is a very different feature. But if you went back and you read just this headline, you would have a very different visual. I should have actually just put this headline up and had everyone draw a picture of what they imagined this would look like. And I promise you that probably none of you would draw something that looked like this tiny little bone spur in the back of your skull. So an interesting story, and has directly to do with skull morphology, which is what we're going to get at in a second, but also a nice case study in why we need to be careful about news reports about scientific studies sometimes, because they're not always reported with the proper diligence, and nor are studies often conducted with the proper diligence. That's my story today. Questions, comments, concerns? I'm gonna feel the back of your skull and see if you've got this guy going on. Like, man, look, I use my phone too much. Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Is this a peer-reviewed journal article?
This scientific reports is a peer-reviewed journal. Yeah, and I provide a link to the original study as well as the. I think I put the Washington Post link up. The two kind of popular news articles that have these headlines, and that's in your program for Wednesday. You can check that out. I won't ask you questions about this on your quiz on Friday, but I will on later quizzes and exams. The question will probably have something to do with this vocabulary word. Cool. All right, let's talk about the skull. So, overview of the geography of the skull. The skull is broken up into two major divisions that are, of course, linked, but we have our facial bones, which forms the front of your skull, and the cranium or cranial vault, which consists of the superior and lateral and posterior regions of the skull. Basically everything that's not your face, right? Which is the majority of your head when you take a look at that. The cranium, we call the cranial vault, is the top part of the cranium you see here, whereas the cranial base is this kind of bottom part here on which the brain rests. Mostly composed of the occipital bone. We'll talk about that in a second. Whereas the vault is composed of a number of other bones. You have the frontal bone, you have these paired temporal bones, and then you have these paired parietal bones. We're going to get to details on that, but I just want to introduce you to the general geography of that. And especially since we generally use the term skull and cranium interchangeably. Technically, the cranium is a subdivision of the skull because the skull includes the facial bones and the cranium. So let's take a look at the bones of the cranium. They provide some important functions. The first and most obvious is that they enclose and protect the brain, right? We talked about stability versus flexibility trade-offs. A great example here of where we are 100% in on stability. There is no flexibility at all in those joints between those bones because we want a strong protective case around our brain because our brain is really important. Not only that, but the skull provides attachment sites for muscles of the head and neck to provide movement of the head generally, but also important for using your mouth for chewing or talking, as well as facial expressions, which are super important for us humans. The facial bones, on the other hand, they form the framework of the face, and they provide important cavities for sense organs, including sight, so your eyes, taste, your mouth and tongue, and smell, of course, your nose. And they provide openings for food and air, which need to go in, in the case of food, in and out in the case of air. And of course, they hold your teeth in place, which seems rather obvious, but that's important to note because your teeth, it would be difficult to be around without your teeth. And finally, the muscles of your face are anchored to these facial bones as well. And I guess I mentioned that there was some attachments of muscles for facial expressions in the cranium. That's true, although the majority of them have their origins on these facial bones, although some do, especially on the frontal bone of the cranium, like when you raise your eyebrows out of curiosity. All right, so if we look at a skull, so this is a skull cut in a transverse section from a superior view. In other words, you're looking down on the top of someone's head. We see some bony ridges that divide the cranial cavity into three distinct fossae. Remember, a fossa is kind of a broad, flat area of a bone. So, for example, we talked about the fossa of the scapula. You have three fossa on the scapula. We have three on the skull as well. There is the anterior cranial fossa. You see these are very cleverly named too. The middle cranial fossa, and breakfast burrito to anyone who can guess what the last one's called. Posterior, who said it? You said it, okay, I owe you a breakfast burrito. It's the posterior cranial fossa. Very straightforward to remember these. The anterior is up front, middle is here, and the posterior formed almost entirely by the occipital bone is back here. And the brain sits upon all three of those. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. But what I want you to take away from here is that we have these three kind of broad, flat regions, and on which the brain rests. And this looks like this. So this is a sagittal plane looking at the skull from a cross section. Notice that what's a little weird about this diagram is we have all of the frontal bones. There's no cut through the frontal bones, yet we do have this kind of sagittal cut through the bones of the cranium. The takeaway point here is you can see that the brain rests on all three of those cranial fossae, the anterior, the middle, and the posterior. And you can see parts of the brain. We're going to get to the nervous system next, actually, in our class. We've got the frontal lobe, we've got the cerebrum here, and then we've got this guy, the cerebellum down here, that rests on that posterior cranial fossa. In addition to these three fossa, the skull contains some smaller cavities. I'm just going to go through these in general. We have cavities for our ears. We have cavities for our nose. We have cavities for our eyes. And then we have these air-filled sinuses that occur in lots of bones around the nasal cavity. I'm going to show you these in more detail. I just want to kind of provide an outline here of these important features on the skull. Remember in lab we talked about sinuses. These are these air-filled pockets within the bones. So if you remember the one station where you had the 19 different bone structures to check out, one of them was the sinuses. I had the sticker on there, and you couldn't really see the sinus because it's inside the bone. I just had it on that location. And if you remember, it was on the anterior cranial fossa where I had that, and that is just over a sinus in the frontal bone. We'll look at that in a little more detail in just a second here. So we've got all these cavities in the skull, and here's what this looks like. So this is a coronal section through a skull. Looking at it, it looks kind of cool, actually. And you can see the position of these sinuses. You can see the two orbits associated with the eye. You've got big sinuses in your maxillary bones here. You've got your nasal cavity. And then you've got some other features here as well. You can see those bones from a different angle. We're going to walk through the names of all these bones in just a minute, so don't worry about that now. It's the terms in red that I'm pointing out that I'm highlighting on this diagram here, those important cavities in the skull.
You just have to know, do we just have to know the names of them and just like a general idea of what they are?
Yeah. And right now I'm focusing on these terms in red. We're going to get to some of these other bones in just a minute, but I just want to point this out. Basically what I'm doing right now is giving you the lay of the land, kind of talking about the skull in a big sense, and then we'll get into a lot of these details. And we're going to walk through each bone part, because the skulls of the bones of the skull are really weird. They're really odd shaped, and they're kind of surprising in a lot of ways.
Can these go back one slide?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
All right, so if we go to a sagittal view, did you get what you needed?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
yep. If we look at a sagittal view of an actual skull here, you can see what some of those sinuses look like. Again, this is the same information as the previous side, just now we're looking at it on an actual skull, and you can see what they look like. What I want to point out here is this frontal sinus. You can see how this cavity is completely encased by the frontal bone, right? Now, there's a lot of diagrams, a lot of stuff going on here. I want to acknowledge that, and I made a study guide for what we're going to talk about with the skull that has a whole bunch of diagrams on it for you of the upcoming slides. I know this has been fairly popular in class later, so you can pull that up. You can save your own version of it. I'll give you a second to do that. Most of the diagrams I've taken off the labels because I'm super mean, and I want you to be able to add those as we walk through. But it will have a lot of the drawings that will be helpful for you that correspond with these upcoming slides. I should have put a link to this in the program for Wednesday, but I didn't. But I suppose we'll have the video recording. You can always go back and grab that. Everyone got that? See a few of you still pulling it up. It's working okay?
It's just like opening it to slides, so it's not putting it the thing.
The thing. I'm not sure if I understand.
Like the actual like study guide. It's just like bringing me to Google Slides.
Yeah, so it's a set of Google Slides.
Yeah, but it's not like going me to the study guide. It's just like bringing me to Google Slides.
Oh, it doesn't have the is anyone else having that same issue? You went to the you can see all the set of Google Slides. I'm not sure. Try it again. It probably has to do with the settings in your phone, or just if you're note that it is linked up. So this link is set to share with anyone in the OWU community. So you need to be logged into Google Slides with your OWU address to see it. That's probably the problem. Okay, good. Yep. Yeah, I have that. I generally have it set up that way. So if you ever have a trouble getting a survey or it's Google Slides, it's usually because you're not logged into your OWU account. True, go ahead.
Is this like so medial that we don't see the orbits? Or like where's the...
Oh, good question. Let's see. Where is this cut? Yeah, okay, so this guy is gonna be mid-sagittal, so it's right down the middle, so we don't see the orbits, because basically you're eliminating the orbit that's closer to you, and the other orbit is just gonna be behind there. So that's yeah.
Is that frontal sinus like right in between the two orbits?
Mm-hmm.
So like you would take like a parasagittal cut, and that was what you wouldn't see
The frontal sinus is kind of right up here. It's this one that gets achy when you're sick, basically. Mm-hmm. It's in the frontal bone, which you'll see in just a second. All right, so you got those slides pulled up. There are 85 named openings and different features, including foramina, canals, and fissures, as well as a couple meatus on the skull. We're not going to memorize all of them, but I am going to make sure you know what they do, why we have all these little holes poking through our skull. And also there will be a set of them that we will know in detail. We have a lab on the skull. It's the second lab after spring break is on the skull, so you have a chance to explore all this stuff in more detail. The important thing, though, is that in general, these holes serve, well, we talked about the cavities related to your sense organs, with your eyes, your ears, and your nose. But these openings provide a way for the brain to give and receive, or what am I trying to say? To be connected with a couple different systems. Importantly, the spinal cord, which comes up through your neck into what's called the Foramen Magnum, which literally means the big hole in the base of your skull. We have blood vessels, which go to the brain and travel through those holes, obviously very important, as well as a number of nerves. And specifically, there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves that contain branches that exit the skull through these holes. So in general, I do want you to know, we're not going to memorize all 85 of these, unless you really want to, but I want you to know why they're there, and that they're except for the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord comes in, the rest of them are almost always for nerves or blood vessels. And we can look at the skull here. So you have this diagram. I'm not going to spend time walking through each of these structures, but I want to provide this diagram so you can see an intact skull from the lateral view, and you can see not only all of these bones, which are in bold, so the mandible, maxilla, zygomatic, but also some of these processes. So this is a nice reference for you As we get to lab, this will be a nice reference. I'm not going to walk through that right now because I'm going to walk through each of those bones in more detail right now. Before I do that, questions?
In terms of the different sutures, is it going to be some of the more basic ones, or are we going to get like the main, like some of those? Because you see on like the occipital bone, it's like kind of there's a lot. Are we going to get into those? Or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We'll do it right now. Let's do it. So the cranial bones, I mentioned that the calvaria is also known as the cranial vault. That is all of the bones on the superior, anterior, and inferior regions of the skull. And as I said, they provide attachment sites for muscles of the head and neck. And the cranium is formed from 8 large bones. And you will need to know all 8 of these. There's only 8, especially since 4 of them are paired. We have paired temporal bones, paired parietal bones, and then we have 4 unpaired bones, your frontal, occipital, sphenoid, and ethmoid. You can get this list down now, but I'm going to walk through each of these bones, and I'm going to show you what they look like in great detail. And actually, I think what I'm going to do is you have this list here. These same bones are in blue on this. I think it's easier to see that list so you can see what bones they actually are. So these are the bones of the cranial vault, or the calvaria. Notice we have, what do I want to say here? Let me just go back for 1 second. Yep. We have a couple bones up front that are a little hard to see from this angle. We have the ethmoid bone and the sphenoid bone. These are some funky bones that you can't see a lot of from this angle, but they're actually pretty sizable. They're just inside the skull, obfuscated by the other bones right now. The frontal bone is this big guy. This is your forehead, so going from your brow and the superior region of your eye socket back to just about here. Then you've got your parietal bones. There's 2 of them on either side. That makes up most of your cranial vault. Laterally, we have 2 temporal bones right here. These are actually pretty funky shaped bones too. I'm going to walk you through some details. But notice that part of this bone sticks out and forms what we call the zygomatic arch right here, which is your cheekbone, right? You can feel that really nice right there. If you feel your cheekbone right under your eye and kind of slide backwards on it, you can feel right where this arm of the temporal bone meets the broader part of the temporal bone right there. And then finally we have our occipital bone, which is a single bone in the back here. You can see it looks kind of small from this angle, but it's actually pretty sizable. It extends underneath your skull and provides the base, that posterior cranial fossa, where your cerebellum and part of your cerebrum rest. So that's the major bones. This diagram here, you will eventually know everything that's labeled on this diagram. So the bones, the sutures are on here, the zygomatic process, and a few other things as well. We're going to walk through those, so I'll cover them in detail, but this is a good reference diagram because anything that's on here is fair game. And as I walk through this, I'll be explicit about which diagrams have information that I want you to know. So we're just starting off now talking about the bones. We'll talk about the sutures and some of those features in upcoming slides. Sound good? All right, let's do it. Cranial bones. So we got the parietal bones first. These are these big guys right here. And what is cool is you can see where they come together. This is a posterior view here, and you can see that they form the vast majority of the rear and the top of your skull. They're also involved in the 4 largest sutures, and I'm going to walk you through these. The first is the coronal suture. So remember, a coronal plane cuts through the body in this direction. That coronal suture basically goes right there, kind of like a crown right across the back of your forehead, basically. And that is the suture between the parietal bone and the frontal bone. We haven't talked about that in detail yet, but you orient yourself to it. Then we have the squamous suture. This is the suture between the temporal and the parietal bones. You have 2 of these sutures, one on the left and one on the right. And it's called the squamous suture because this broad, flat area of the temporal bone is the squamous part of the temporal bone. So big, flat, it comes from the word for scale. So the big flat area. So you have the squamous suture in there. We then have the lambdoid suture, which is this suture between the parietal and the occipital bones in the back. It's called the lambdoid suture because if you look at it from the posterior, It looks kind of like the Greek letter lambda, kind of comes up here like that, right? Kind of, maybe. So that's the Landoid Suture. Notice there's a couple little bones right here. I'll talk about these, but these are called Sutural Bones. Some of you have them, some of you don't. We don't know. It's a mystery. We don't really know why they're important or what they do. But remember when we started talking about the skeletal system, I said most of us have on average about 206 bones, but that can vary. So we learned about the fibula, those sesamoid bones and the ligaments of the knee. We're learning now about these sutural bones, which you can have a few of in your skull as well. And that's why the number of bones can vary among individuals. As far as we know, these aren't kind of functionally important. Doesn't really matter if you have them or not, so don't worry about it. But some of you might be lucky. And some of our skulls in lab actually have these sutural bones. They're pretty cool. And finally, we have the sagittal suture. This is a suture that is between the left and the right parietal bone. So remember, sagittal plane is like this. Sagittal suture, so named because it goes right down the middle of the skull from anterior to posterior. So I'm introducing here the parietal bones, but also talking about these four sutures that are important to know as well. And I'll talk about each of those other bones. This is another diagram where everything, you should know everything on this one. Questions?
You have a slide a little ago, just like the general part of the cranial bones.
Mm-hmm.
Is that would so like for there's like 2 slides ago just about the cranial bones. Is all you have to know is that it comes from 8 large bones, and that's like pretty much all you have to know. Like just like the parts mainly.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the slides that say everything, you should know everything on this diagram. Yeah, so that's what you should know. Yep. This is slide, I got a little ahead of myself. But the sutural bones that I mentioned, these guys can appear, they appear when you're young, and they can vary in size and shape and location. As we kind of talked about this a little earlier, we're not going to cover it in too much detail, but developmentally, these bones, these sutures don't exist in newborns. Instead, they're connected by cartilage, and that gives the head some flexibility. We talked about that a little bit. And as they develop, sometimes you get these sutural bones developing in between there. This is the Greek letter lambda, by the way, just to see what this Landoid suture looks like. It's kind of like that. Mm-hmm.
We only have them at the Lambdoid Suture.
Oh, that's a good question. I believe they're most common back here, but you can have them in other places as well. The prevalence of them in those other areas, I'm not 100% sure about. This is the skulls we have in the lab. I think we should check, but I think the only examples of them we see in our specimens are in the Lambdoid suture, but let's check that in lab. All right, talked about the parietal bones, some of the sutures associated with that. I next want to talk about the frontal bone. So this is obviously a frontal view of the skull. This guy forms the forehead and the tops of the orbits of the eye, the superior aspect of the eye orbits. And it contains a number of features that I want to make sure you know. The first is what's called the supraorbital margin. So remember, supra means above, orbit refers to the eye orbit. And so this is essentially the top part of your eye socket. And you can feel that very prominently well if you gently put your finger just below your eyebrow, above your eye, and kind of move it on the top of your eyelid there. You can feel that ridge very prominently. That's your supraorbital margin. We also have the supraorbital foramen, which is these little holes right here, and this is where a nerve passes, a nerve and an artery pass to enter into pass from the brain to your forehead. You can't feel that. We have this flat area you can feel for sure, just superior to your nose, this big flat spot right here where I'm pushing, that's your glabella. It's kind of a broad flat area just superior to the nose. And then finally, we have frontal sinuses, which you can't see in this diagram here because they're inside the bone, but they are just lateral to the glabella. And so those guys are just right here, and right here we have those sinuses. And again, this is a diagram. There's a bunch of stuff on there. Oh, that got cut off, but make sure you got everything on this diagram as well. So we've covered so far 3 of the 8 bones. We've covered the 2 parietal bones, as well as the frontal bones. We've got a few more to walk through here. Just going to give you a second to get these notes down. All right, let's talk next about the occipital bone. Occipit refers to, it's Latin or Greek? Latin, for the back of the head. And as I mentioned, it forms the primarily the inferior and also a bit of the posterior portion of the cranium. And we saw that it has sutures with the parietal bones at those lambdoid sutures and the temporal bones. This is a new suture I didn't cover previously, but the Occipitomastoid sutures. I'll show you that in a diagram in just a second here. The occipital bone also does something that no other bone in your skull does, and that is that it articulates with the rest of your skeleton. In fact, this is the only joint between your skull and the rest of your body, and that is between the occipital bone and the atlas, remember, which is your C1 vertebrae, your top cervical vertebrae. And we have something called an occipital condyle, which is these flat areas that allow it to kind of rock on that atlas and allows you, basically this is like the structure that allows you to say yes and move your head in this direction. It's articulation with that axis of the second cervical vertebrae that pokes up that it allows you to say no and move your head in this direction. The occipital condyles allow your head to rock, and so flexion and extension at the neck. And then in the middle of the occipital bone, we have this foramen magnum, which literally translates as big hole. It's the hole in the base of the skull through which the spinal cord attaches to the brain. I showed you the cranial fossae earlier. This guy, as I mentioned, forms the posterior cranial fossa, which is where your cerebellum and parts of your cerebrum rest. There's also some other features. We'll show you these. It has what's called the hypoglossal foramina. There's two of those guys. We'll talk about this external occipital protuberance. Actually, this is the thing that they were measuring in that study, this external occipital protuberance. You can kind of feel it. Well, maybe some of you can. Depends how much you use your cell phone. You can feel that back here. And we've got what's called nuchal lines too, which are the attachment points for some muscles of the neck. So here's all of that in words. I'm going to show you that in a diagram in just a second. I see lots of people writing, so let me give you a second to catch up on that. I'm going to show you a diagram with all these parts, which I think is a better way to get it. But I have some details here I want to make sure you got first. What I need is a PowerPoint. I could have two screens. I can have like this one and the diagram at the same time. Someday Owu will provide that. Okay, so this is the occipital bone from the posterior view. Just to refresh your memory and orient you a little bit, we have this lambdoid suture here, which is the suture between the occipital bone and the left parietal bone and the right parietal bone. We have these nuchal lines I mentioned, and basically just two of them are important for us right now. That's the superior and the inferior nuchal line. So these are in the back here. This essentially marks the limit of what we call our neck. We have this ridge down the middle called the external occipital protuberance. Oh no, so this isn't what they're measuring in the study. I'm sorry, that's incorrect. They were measuring, what were they measuring in the study? I don't remember which feature it was from the study. So, but it was not the external occipital protuberance. That's this guy right down the middle here. And that forms an important point where ligament attaches down here. And then there was one other thing. Oh, the occipital condyle. That's the feature on the inferiormost portion of the occipital bone where it articulates with the axis, which again is that C1 vertebrae. The last new thing on this diagram is this occipitomastoid suture. And that's the suture here between the temporal bone anteriorly and the occipital bone posteriorly. And we have two of those sutures, one on either side there. So make sure you know those guys as well. So tons of new stuff today, tons of new diagrams. So I want to make sure you got the study guide. You've got lots of time to look it over. Although honestly, probably you're not going to look it over till after break, and that's okay too. Because you've got your quiz and other material coming up on Friday and your practical tomorrow. But I wanted to get it started before break. Questions so far? Good? Okay, so I want to look at the occipital bone. This is actually the same bone, just from a different angle. This is an inferior view, obviously. You've got your occipital bone here. And I mentioned that when you look at the skull laterally, it doesn't look like it's that big. But when you look at it posteriorly, you see how big this bone is, how far anteriorly it extends. Specifically, what you can see here nicely is the Foramen Magnum, that big hole, and those occipital condyles, the kind of smooth areas that articulate with the axis, your C1 vertebrae. The rest of these features you've seen already from a different angle, but it's nice to see them from underneath as well. Let's see, that's good. And you've got this diagram too, will be key as well. So I'm dumping a lot of features on you. Just know that we'll revisit all of these. You also see these in lab, so we'll reiterate it. I don't expect you to memorize all of these from this single lecture today. So now we've covered four. We've covered half of the cranial bones, right? We've covered the frontal bone. We've covered the occipital bone. We've covered the paired parietal bones. That's four. Now we're going to get to two more, and they are paired the temporal bones. So the temporal bones actually get their name. This is rather random, but as folks age, sometimes they get this gray hair in this area, just kind of superior and anterior to their ear, and that's kind of an indication that time is passing or you're getting old. Hence the name temporal bone. Yeah, it's interesting, but there it is. So temporal bone, you get gray hairs on the side of your head. The temporal bone is really complicated and has three main parts that we're going to walk through. The squamous part of the temporal bone, the styloid, and the petrous and mastoid. And we'll talk about those. There's some words here I don't need you to worry about. This has to do with where these bones come from during development. I'm not going to get into that in this course. We're kind of skipping over some of those developmental aspects. So don't worry about dermatocranium, splanocranium, and chondrocranium. Just focus on these three sections. I meant to take that off the slide and I didn't. So temporal bone. It's a funky guy that looks like this. It does not, like if someone just handed you one of these, you wouldn't say, oh, that's part of the skull. I want to walk you through some of the main parts and some of the main features here. This big flat part I mentioned is the squamous part. That's this kind of big flat area. Remember, it has the suture here with the parietal bone along here. Then we have, let's see, how do I want to cover this? Let me just talk about the major parts that you see in red here first. We have the petrous part. This is like a big, thicker area and includes, importantly, this mastoid process. Now, this is a bump where we have attachment points for muscles of the neck. It also has some sinuses in it as well. And you can feel this very prominently. So just go posterior to your ear, kind of back in here, like right in there. And you can feel that bump right there. There, I got it right there. You can feel that that is your mastoid process. We also have the tympanic part of the bone, so called because it surrounds the external auditory meatus. So this is the hole through which is your ear canal, the hole through your ear canal, basically. It also has this long protuberance called the styloid process. Remember that the words, if you see stylo, that comes from the word for stake or pillar. It's also used for like a pen. And this is an important attachment point for some other muscles, as well as an attachment point for your hyoid bone that we'll talk about later on. We have another couple other important features. We have this fossa right in here. This is where your mandible articulates with your with the cranium, right? So this is where your jawbone articulates. So you can feel that area right here. If you just go up just anterior to your ear and clench your mouth, that your jawbone, your mandible, is articulating right here with your temporal bone. That is the only movable, only diarthritic and synovial joint in your skull. The rest of your skull joints are synarthritic, right? So this is the single example of a synovial diarthritic joint in the skull right there. And finally, I mentioned the zygomatic process. So this part of the bone sticks out and forms the posterior part of what we call your oh God, what's this thing called? In common parlance, why can't I think of this word? Cheekbone, yeah, geez, okay. Words sometimes just disappear on me. And that forms the anterior, or the posterior part of your cheekbone right there. So again, this diagram, a lot of stuff here, a lot of features on the temporal bone that you'll be familiar with. Let's see, did I cover all of those? I did. Questions? Yeah, Ethan.
What kind of defines the petrous from the squamous? Like, when do we know we're from one part to another?
Oh, just about over here.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not a solid line or anything like that. Developmentally, they come from different parts of, they have different origins and they fuse at a certain point in development. But like the coccygeal bone, there's no line delimiting those parts in an adult skull, so you can't really tell the difference. So it's kind of somewhere around here.
Is it the same with the tympanicum, that was a different part of, that was a different bone?
Exactly. So developmentally, you had 3 parts of this bone that all come together. And I think the styloid actually comes from a different part developmentally too.
So between those two bones, would the petrous part have more spongy bone in it?
Oh gosh. So in the flat bones of the skull, remember that's called diploid. And the petrous part is thicker, so I would assume that it would have more diploid in it. Yeah. That's a good question. Actually, I never thought about it quite like that, but yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Lots of bones. Let's talk a little bit more about the temporal bone. We have these foramina in here. So these are holes in the bone where we have various, again, nerves and blood vessels passing through. We're going to cover these in more detail in lab coming up. So I'm not going to go over these in a lot of detail right now. But there are, let's see. I'm just trying to think about which ones I want to make sure you know. So this is an inferior aspect. So this is an intact skull looking from the bottom. You can see some of those holes. I don't need you to know all of these right now. I just wanted to introduce you. The takeaway message from this slide is there's a whole bunch of holes in the inferior aspect of the skull through which blood vessels and nerves pass. And if we flip the skull around and we look down on it, so this is a skull cut in a transverse plane, you're looking down on it, there are 4 passageways I do want you to know associated with the temporal bone, and that is this foramen lacerum, the internal acoustic meatus. So this is that there's a long canal that attaches the external and internal ear. This is the internal opening for that. We have the jugular foramen. We'll talk about that when we get to the circulatory system, where the jugular vein enters the head. And then we have this hypoglossal canal, and this is where an important cranial nerve passes. So note these 4 highlighted in red for right now. There's others as well, but I don't want you to, I'm already overwhelming you with enough new information. We don't need to know every single one. And let's see, we've got 2 more bones that are super funky, and I'm going to stop here and give you some other announcements and information and a chance to catch your breath after this whirlwind lecture on the bones of the skull. Before I do that, what questions do you have for me? The sphenoid bone is wild. Then we get into the facial bones. There's all kinds of stuff. The skull's pretty complicated. We do cover the skull in pretty good detail, as you'll see. Okay, whoop. All right, so just a few reminders. Your lab practical is tomorrow. The lab is open through tomorrow morning. I have it set to be locked out at 7 a.m. tomorrow, so you can get in there and study anytime between now and then, with the exception of between 2 and 4 this afternoon, which time I'll be teaching a class in there. Remember, if you're in the morning lab, we're starting at 10:30. That gives me a chance to set everything up and be ready for you. The afternoon lab, you see if your name is in these first 2 columns, you're starting at 1:10. If you're over here, you're starting at 2:30. If anything comes up and that whatever, just let me know. But otherwise, I'm just splitting it up to kind of keep things moving a little more fluidly. Also, I have a study guide available. I realized in my slides on Friday, I mistakenly said it was available in Blackboard. I put it in visible body. Everything for lab is in visible body. A few of you email me about that. Just make sure that you can see that and get that. It kind of doesn't contain any new information, but distills a few things from labs and kind of I cut and paste a lot of diagrams from your other labs to have it all in one place for you. Makes it a little bit easier. That's the deal for lab practical tomorrow. What questions do you have about that? This is probably your last chance to ask questions as a group. Cool. Note that if obviously, just to make sure I'm clear, if you're in the afternoon class, the lab is not available for you to come in the morning, obviously, either. So if you want to study, let me rephrase that. Make sure that you study before 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. I'm assuming that everyone wants to study. Otherwise, a few other just reminders. Quiz 3 will be on Friday. It will be up in Blackboard from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. And we're going to do that in lieu of class on Friday, kind of give ourselves a little bit of a break as we go into spring break. I know some of you are probably traveling and that kind of thing, so we will not meet in this classroom. Instead, you'll have your quiz. You do have a class program for Wednesday. As I mentioned, it's really short, but it does have information about this quiz for you. And you won't have a class program over spring break. So that's going to be your last class program until we get back in action after spring break. Remember, I've got my open hours today, noon to 2, in our lab room. And otherwise, I just have a, ignore this thing about the drawings from today's class. It just has some questions about today's class to check for understanding. You can go ahead and complete that and let me know if you have any questions.